did we get here? How is it that the USDA put out guidelines that are so different from the way our ancestors ate? Since those guidelines came out, a lot of people have gained weight. Is it possible this approach isn't the best for some overweight people? The evidence shows that it might be exactly wrong for many, if not most, overweight people. In fact, a high-fat, low-carb way of eating has been known to be effective for over 150 years. In the 1800s, when modern medicine was first starting to use evidence for treatment, highly respected scholars were reporting on success with a low-carb diet for weight loss. It was conventional wisdom that to lose weight, you had to stop eating the white stuff. By the 1940s, the first randomized controlled study found that people on a low-carb diet lost more weight. The report states they had a surprising lack of hunger, increased physical energy, and a sense of well-being. The most prestigious healthcare institutions all promoted a low-carb diet for weight loss. Through the 1940s and the 1950s, nobody questioned that weight loss happens when carbohydrate is reduced. The anti-fat movement began in the 1950s with an observational study done by Ancel Keys. He said his data showed that saturated fat caused heart disease. This was also the time when mass media was beginning, and ultimately he was crowned in the press as our first homegrown diet expert. This is the main study that the anti-fat movement referenced as it decried meat in favor of heart-healthy grains. The problem is, he selected only certain bits of his full set of data to report on, and many years later, his full data set was analyzed, and it showed no correlation between eating saturated fat and heart disease. But the horse was already out of the barn by then. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, anti-fat was gaining popularity, and more low-fat versions of our favorite foods were showing up on market shelves. But even into the 70s, major institutions still recommended the low-carb diet for weight loss. Between 1967 and 1975, there were 5 major conferences on obesity that recommended a low-carb approach. They noted that the evidence for low fat was very weak. By the mid-1970s, the anti-fat movement was already established and had become very vocal and influential in the media. Even though there had not been one good quality study that showed saturated fat caused heart disease, the politicians who held hearings about nutrition invited primarily the anti-fat folks to testify. They won the day with the government, and the food pyramid was born. Many scientists and healthcare institutions were shocked at the low-fat recommendations. They said there was no scientific basis. The AMA said it raised the potential for harmful effects. A leading scientist said it was like performing a nutritional experiment on the American public. But it was too late. Low-fat foods were everywhere, and low fat for health became a cultural norm in this country. In the 1980s, 5 major NIH studies were finally completed. 4 showed no benefit to longevity, and in fact, one showed that people eating low fat died sooner. The Framingham Heart Study was published in the 90s. It also shows no benefit. In fact, people who ate the most saturated fat weighed the least and had the lowest serum cholesterol. By 2010, there was a meta-analysis that looked at 21 studies collectively and found that there is no relationship between eating saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. Since then, in the last 15 years, there have been over 25 randomized controlled studies that show that a high-fat, low-carb way of eating is safe, and in fact, better than a low-fat, high-carb way of eating for both weight loss and normalizing key indicators of heart trouble like HDL cholesterol and triglycerides. So we don't need to be afraid of saturated fat after all. And 150 years of evidence shows that a high-fat, lower-carb diet will help us lose weight. This is how our ancestors ate. Remember, geneticists say it takes 10,000 generations to adapt. Is it possible that there are a subset of humans who simply do not tolerate the recommended diet from the 1970s, who have a metabolism that hasn't really adapted to this high-carb world? There is evidence to suggest some differences between those in our culture who get fat and those who somehow don't. If you have this primal metabolism, then you may see overwhelmingly positive results when you switch to a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet. Some of us still have the metabolism of our ancestors and have stored pounds and pounds of fat on our bodies because of a metabolic disorder that many overweight people share. We produce too much insulin. In our next video, we'll look inside our bodies and understand what has caused the unnecessary storage of fat and how a lower carb diet actually works to stop the incessant cravings for sweets and starches and heal this common metabolic disorder.